Hello, everybody. It's Mike Yao with Savage Kingdom's role-playing game and Fire in the Head Productions. So today I thought I would do a video about Dark Ages role-playing games. For example, Savage Kingdoms is set in kind of a sort of a Dark Ages kind of era, and what that means and how you can kind of create one and how it kind of differentiates from our typical medieval fantasy, which of course means I think when a lot of people hear medieval fantasy, they just assume, yeah, swords and dragons and magic, sorcery, and that kind of stuff. And they're not wrong, but if you hone it in a little bit more, you can. There's various subgenres of fantasy, and I know I've done some videos in the past about sword and sorcery and high fantasy. What's the difference? And then there's little subgenres in between. There's modern fantasy like Harry Potter, stuff like that. So there are different types of fantasy obviously genres and settings. So, but Savage Kingdoms is set in more as a Dark Ages setting, and those of you who have played it or know me, you know you're pretty familiar with that, right? Um, there are a lot of players that play are not particularly they're not historians or whatever. I'm not a historian either. I do have a passion for kind of the Dark Ages and Middle Ages, and which a lot of us do as medieval fantasy gamers. But most of us really aren't actual historians. We just kind of learn what we can through history, doing medieval reenactments, and seeing what we see on YouTube or various specials on television, whatever, or textbooks, God forbid. And that's kind of where we get our knowledge from. So most, the typical player wouldn't really necessarily know the difference between, oh, your setting is more of a Dark Ages setting as opposed to a High Middle Ages, whereas somebody more astute in history would kind of know more what you're talking about. However, on the other hand, it is a fantasy setting, right? So I'm going to explain kind of what that means when I say a Dark Ages TTRPG, tabletop role playing game. So, starting off with what is Dark Ages, right? What does the term Dark Ages mean? It's a term that gets thrown around a lot. Historians still cling to that term. It seems to be some parts of the historian community, scientific historian community, are kind of getting away from that. I mean, it's still kind of called the Dark Ages, but as more information has come to light, it seems like it's not quite as a dark age as many would have assumed. So let's go back to what it actually means. So as far as Northern European history, Dark Ages was pretty much when the Roman Empire withdrew from Britannia, which is what they called, Britannia is what they called, which was Britain, right, or Britain as the Picts called it, Prydain. But anyway, Britannia, of course, is what the Romans called that provincial island there, the island of the mighty. So when they withdrew in around 410, it's going off the top of my head, but I think that's accurate. And they withdrew for various reasons. The Roman Empire kind of overextended. It was kind of getting a little decadent. It's almost kind of like, I hate to say, like kind of the United States has kind of become. I don't think we're quite as in bad shape, but maybe we're heading that way, where we've kind of maybe overreached, like the country's almost a little too big to control. England had that kind of thing when they overexpanded. So all of these great empires of the past and even present tend to have kind of overexpanded after a while. And then something called decadence kind of sets in wherever you were, where the society is kind of faltering a little bit, and it's kind of in some ways it's a good thing. It can kind of cause things to come back together and more collective instead of having spread out and colonizing. And the whole colonizing thing can be very problematic as well. Um, so that's basically what Dark Ages meant when the Roman Empire withdrew from Britain in 410. And then around the rest of the world, there were obviously things going on as well. So they had their own kind of Dark Ages. So I'm talking about this period roughly between 410, and it lasted roughly 500 years, 400 or 500 years. And it kind of covers into the Viking Age, which came around from the 7th to 9th century. You had the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, these Northern European kind of raider slash trader settling cultures that came into the UK and also various parts of mainland Britain, and they sort of settled, and sometimes they raided and they fought and stuff like that. But anyway, that whole sort of milieu, that whole sort of era is what I'm talking about with Dark Ages. So that's kind of the actual history of it. my next little note here. I'm looking at my note. Hi, one of my cats is visiting me, Nymeria, the black and white one. It's very cute. Off camera, unfortunately. So we went over the kind of the actual history. Next, atmospheric darkness. And I'm not sure exactly why I put that there. Oh, yeah, right. So what I was talking about with the Dark Ages is what historians often kind of referred to somewhat flippantly nowadays. Another reason a Dark Ages setting, which is what I prefer, this is why I've set Savage Kingdoms in it when I created it 11 years, well, when I published it 11 years ago, it's actually much older, is because the term atmospheric darkness. So I feel like when you have a setting set in kind of a Dark Ages era, um, also the term darkness kind of gives it shadow and mystery, and I find that really cool, particularly for a grittier, more grounded fantasy setting, which is what Savage Kingdoms is. I've used my Savage Kingdoms setting for like Dungeons and Dragons, which is more high fantasy. And it doesn't quite fit as well, but when I do it, because I do run D&D for youth groups, and sometimes I do run stuff out of Forgotten Realms. But I do run occasionally adventures or even full campaigns out of my setting, and the reason I do that is because I have all of the lore is in my head. I mean, obviously it's been published in Savage Kingdoms books too, but it's all right at my fingertips. And it's far easier for me to know the history and back history and the deity and the gods and the languages and all the lore for the Savage Kingdom setting than it is like Forgotten Realms, which I'm not as familiar. I'm like moderately familiar with, and I don't connect to it as much as my own as you would imagine, because it's my own creation. But so when you use the term darkness and dark ages, I think that's really cool for atmospheric descriptions of like kind of a grittier, dark, mysterious milieu, and that is why I do like setting my game in the dark ages. Another reason I like to do that is because it's not. This is kind of my next little note. Not medieval, really, is my silly note. Not medieval quote, really, meaning that the term kind of flippant term is medieval fantasy. A lot of people would say fantasy, but I always like to say medieval fantasy because I think that quantifies a little bit more. But it's not really medieval, right? It's the Dark Ages is kind of the era before the medieval period or Middle Ages period, and even that period has like different little sub eras, right? So that's another reason I like to do Dark Ages because it's it's atmospheric with the darkness. B, it's more mysterious because we don't know as much about it as in the real world what happened in the Dark Ages, meaning that there's a lot more stuff to play with, in my opinion. A lot more things like that you can kind of create and craft, and without anybody saying, "Oh, well, that's not how it would have been done." It's like um, first of all, it's a fantasy setting, so it can be done however the creator wants it to be. But secondly, if you were trying to base it somewhat on history, there's not as much published and known about that era, therefore creating more mystery and stuff that you can kind of fill in yourself. So this is not medieval fantasy; it's Dark Ages fantasy, right? And this is why I typically call Sword and or Savage Kingdoms a sword and sorcery game. I know it's not fully. I've done several videos on that. It's not fully sword and sorcery in the purest sense because that's typically set in like an age undreamed of, as Robert E. Howard says with his Hyborian age and his Conan world. It's meaning that it was kind of prehistory, right? But even in the prehistory, if you look at the descriptions of a lot of the sword and sorcery settings, particularly the Hyborian age, it does a lot of it kind of resounds as age of antiquity. However, there are several cultures in Robert E. Howard's, and the same with Savage Kingdoms, honestly, that really kind of go into the Dark Ages and possibly even the early Middle Ages. Some of the kingdoms in his setting have a little bit higher tech level than some of the others, which is really cool, as that makes it far more interesting. It's not particularly realistic. I mean, it can be. I think a lot of times we always assume that if one culture has invented all this stuff, then everybody around them obviously levels up as well. And while that is mostly true in history, that's not necessarily always true. Take for example, uh, say for the technology of some of the some of the Western cultures in this land, and we encounter a tribe in the Amazon, and maybe their tech level is still way down, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe that's just how they might want it that way. A lot of it has to do with they haven't really made any contact with some of these other, like quote high tech cultures. But it could be that, and there's some proof of this too, with some of the early Mayan and Aztec cultures, they might have made contact with some of the quote higher technological cultures, and maybe they adapted a few things, but they really mostly kind of shunned it. They really kind of stayed in their way. So what I'm getting at, if you do have a setting like the Hyborian Age, or even like Savage Kingdoms, where you do have kind of what seems to be almost various tech levels within the kind of the grand scope of Dark Ages, don't worry about that. I think that's fine. I think it's totally cool. That's one world building technique, and that's what Robert E. Howard was going for. And uh, another reason Howard created his setting that way, just to kind of go on that little subject for a moment, is that originally he was writing historical fiction, and he would occasionally run across an editor or a reader that would be like, "Well, the Picts didn't have steel, or so and so didn't have that," and so he actually got a little, and he was like pretty young at the time, so maybe a little impetuous. He was like, "Well, fine, I'm gonna create my own world that's kind of Earth adjacent, an age undreamed of, and before recorded history." So very smart actually to do that. So that way he could kind of do whatever he wants to, and kind of like have several cultures and kingdoms that were simulated. Like Stygia was basically Egypt or early Egypt. Aqua Aquilonia is basically kind of a early to high Middle Ages. It's got kind of Roman elements, but also some kind of like French elements as well. Um, Very cool. So that way you could have those different things that were very expressive of real world cultures and events without it actually being. So he basically created a fantasy setting, but it was very grounded in history. So it's got kind of a historical fiction, historical fantasy feel to it. Historical fantasy, personally, is one of my favorite subgenres of fantasy, if not my favorite, because I like stuff to be grounded. I'm also very fascinated with the Dark Ages, the ancient world history in general, really, but particularly from the age of antiquity to the kind of early to Middle Ages is really kind of where I shine. But history in general has always been fascinating to me, and I think a lot of gamers as well. So anyway, that is about the Dark Ages in general, about using actual history, atmospheric darkness, and the fact that it's not medieval really. Oh, and to finish that point, another reason why I like a Dark Ages setting is that there's so many fantasy settings that are set in a high medieval period or even early Renaissance. Renaissance is fine. It's not my favorite era, honestly. I know a lot of people like that. It's really not my. Once you start getting into all the fancy titles and the really fancy, fluffy clothing and stuff like that, I just kind of lose interest personally. Uh, but my point being is that since there are a lot of settings in the High Middle Ages, probably the most obvious one, with all the full plate armor and that sort of thing. Um, but then there are a decent amount of settings, not many, but that are kind of in the antiquated world, ancient world, Bronze Age, even Iron Age. The Dark Age is kind of in between those two. There's not a whole lot going on there, so that's another reason I've chose the Dark Ages. The main reason is because that's my preferred kind of era to sort of play out of, to base my world in. But the secondary reason is because there's not as many, so it does make the Savage Kingdom setting, somewhat more unique. All right, next thing, tech level and such, which I think I already kind of went ahead and said some of that. Meaning that, all right, so first of all, the tech level and such thing, the little category I have, the first thing I have is Savage Kingdom's setting, which I already kind of went over. Uh, so basically, Savage Kingdom setting is mostly set in Dark Ages, kind of like I was making a point with Robert E. Howard's Hyborian Age, Conan the Barbarian's world, where he has kind of different tech levels that are kind of varied from some are like still Bronze Age, maybe even to early Iron Age, all the way into like early medieval. And like I said, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a world building technique because each culture or kingdom or realm or territory you're making, whether it's human or otherwise, there's a lot of stuff we can do in there to play for world building. There's religions, there's history, there's royal lines you could do, there's noble houses, languages, all this really cool stuff. But another layer to add to that is tech levels. And again, You probably don't want to make them super varied. You don't want to get maybe have a Stone Age culture right next to like a Space Age culture. That's kind of unless that's like the setting you're going for. Unless you're going for a very Gonzo kind of everything goes setting. If you're trying to do a little more grounded, somewhat more believable setting, you probably don't want that to happen. But it is good to have some kind of variation in there, and I think it is to some degree realistic, quote unquote. Another thing is sword and sorcery, and I touched on that earlier as well. So the tech level of a typical sword and sorcery setting is like I said, a kind of an prehistory or kind of a age of antiquity, Bronze Age, going into or even Iron Age, um, which is where the riddle of steel comes from that you see in the Conan movie. But also, it's not spelled out as such, but you can see shadows of that playing through the various Conan sagas, and then some of the other later writers of sword and sorcery, particularly what's called uh, New Edge sword and sorcery, which is more modern. They like to use that theme a lot with the riddle of steel and what that kind of represents. A lot of people asked about what that means in the Conan. It means several things, honestly. But in my opinion, I think what it's really based on at its heart is that it was an age where iron was being developed, and those who knew the secret of steel, because steel is kind of like it's iron, right? But it's the next level. You're adding graphite and ashes. You're adding different things into the iron, almost in a magical sense, making craftsmen themselves almost, particularly blacksmiths, magicians in some way, sorcerers who are kind of weaving, or alchemists is probably more accurate, where they're kind of using these kind of secret arts of metallurgy and perhaps speaking enchantments over them, or as people would have believed, in order to produce steel. And so the riddle of steel is basically meaning that yes, maybe you have learned how to work iron, but do you know how to work steel? And there's a whole philosophy on the riddle of steel too. Like steel is flexible yet strong, um, like the spirit could be. So, and that's where the whole thing Thulsa Doom and the flesh is stronger and steel is weaker because flesh is what created the steel in the first place. In other words, the brain, and then the flesh of the hand that wields it. So, anyway, not to get off on that, but I think that's kind of a fascinating thing to look at as far as where you set your setting. Another thing to consider in the tech level and such category that I have is reading slash writing. Uh, oh, right. Okay. That's supposed to trigger these thoughts. So that means, or is your tech level of your kingdom or your setting in general, is it reading and writing? Is the entire populace read slash write their language? Do they even have a written tongue? Another world building thing is really cool, dabbling in writing, like who can read and write? Is there a written system in whatever language it is? What type of writing system? Is it cuneiform? Is it calligraphy? Is it runic? Um, really cool. Is it hieroglyphic based? Is it glyphic based? Is it glyphs? It's like really fascinating stuff that you can do there with the reading and writing. Another level of that is, for example, in Savage Kingdoms, the kingdom of R, generally only the philosophers and the nobles and the priests read and write. The common populace do not, and it's not that, well, it is that they're not taught it, but it's the fact that they consider magic very magical. So only those really capable are trusting in the use of sorcery or the magical arts, um, are the ones who read and write, since that's often used in such things. Although in Savage Kingdoms, you don't have to read or write to learn magical arts, actually, because a lot of it is taught orally, so it's not always by written things in scrolls or books or whatever. Just as a side note there, but it's kind of fun to play with. Like, let's say another example in Savage Kingdoms is in the West. There's the Kimrethi. The Kimrethi are based on ancient Welsh, ancient Celtic Britons from, but more specifically the Cymry, the Cymry, and they are. In real life, not so much, but in like the people of Kimrith, they do not read or write because they don't want to be captured. So they focus on all of this oral tradition, and their druids have like great memories because they memorize all of this lore. And the reason mostly for that is not so much that they think that a certain class of their tribe is more competent with reading and writing. they simply don't want it to be captured by enemies. So if an enemy sweeps in and like takes over your village, you can't capture a bunch of books and scrolls, and therefore capture a lot of the tribe's knowledge. So that's another cool thing to kind of think about when you're world building, when you're putting something in a Dark Ages setting, particularly that's slanted more towards a sword and sorcery thematics going on. The reading and writing thing could be really cool. Another thing is armor, weapons, and inventions. So at a Dark Ages level, you're not going to see a lot of plate armor, at least what we typically think of it. Not field plate or full plate armor. You might see some half plate. I have this, and I mean, uh, just to be clear, like types of plate armor have existed all the way back to the Lorica segmentata that the Roman infantry had. Those were the stripped plates. What we D&D I think kind of calls banded mail, which is on debate whether that's like a thing or not. But call it what you will, whether it's banded mail, Lorica segmentata, which means segmented armor, or plate armor. It really did kind of exist. The Greeks even had the bronze breastplates for a while. It just covered most of your chest, didn't really cover your arms or anything. But they might have added the leather war skirt, the flaps that kind of hang down, to augment the armor a little bit. So in a sense, plate armor has always existed. But when people think of the romanticized thing of a knight wearing plate armor, that's definitely not Dark Ages. So if you're trying to go for a Dark Ages aesthetic, ditch that. You could maybe have plate and chain. In Savage Kingdoms is typically the highest, kind of coolest heavy armor that you can get. The Duergar, which are basically dwarves in my setting, they make something called Duergar full plate. So they're about the only culture that does make these kind of full plate armor. And the reason I did that way is a couple reasons. Because A, I wanted it to be more Dark Ages tech in general, like we've just talked about. But also, I personally am not a big fan of the full, like when the High Middle Ages came around and the massive suits of plate armor with the duck bills and all that. It just does not appeal to me. It just seems really clunky, and I prefer metal, steel, and iron to be more rare and something of a treasure, and just kind of spending on an expensive suit of armor just doesn't connect with me personally. But it might with you, which is totally awesome. But just know if you are trying to do more of a Dark Ages sword and sorcery kind of thing, uh, as far as aesthetics go, yeah, don't do the full plate armor. Uh, so the most common armor would be my kind of favorite kind of armor. I'll be honest, is more like brigandine. And the use of brigandine has a couple of different uses to historians. On one level, and some of you probably already know this. On one level, brigandine was like metal plates sewn inside of like a cloth armor. The other term, which is I think the more original term, and the term that the way I'm approaching it in Savage Kingdoms, it meant armor that brigands wore, meaning that they took a lot of pieces off of captured armor and they augmented it. So basically, it was leather, typically hard leather, cuirass, and then they would attach rings. So this is where you get ring mail from D&D. But in Savage Kingdoms, we just kind of put it all into brigandine. So any kind of leather that's augmented with rings or little metal plates or whatnot, it's really kind of the same. I mean, studded leather armor that D&D has, I know it's up to high debate. Like, why would you stud the armor to make it weaker? However, there's something to be said for having like thick armor and putting like platelets, or even studs on it that may to some degree augment the effectiveness of the armor. So essentially, that's kind of what brigandine are, and that's kind of like that'd be kind of like your average sort of medium armor in a Dark Ages setting. And to me, the whole aspect of the fact that you're taking enemies' kit, like their own armor, and you're augmenting yourself. Just, I don't know, it's really cool to me. I just find that really fascinating. Otherwise, heavy chainmail would be chainmail's been around for a long time. Would be you would see some chainmail if you could afford it. Maybe even leather and chain, which I think is another cool thing where you're layering armor and it's also kind of realistic. Um, Hard leather armor or cure boily, where you're wearing a cuirass is would be kind of cool and somewhat common, but not terribly common. And then you have your soft leathers and your furs, which probably be the most common light armor, like the average commoner or some outlaw or brigand in the forest might have, if anything, would be what we call in Savage Kingdoms like soft leather or furs, which is like one point of armor. But So just as far as the aesthetic goes, as well as the game stats, that's probably the main armor you want to look at. As far as inventions go, the Chinese repeating crossbow was a thing, and I think it did go back to the European Dark Ages, including, but it wasn't really. It didn't really catch on. It was more of a. It was more of a kind of a fluke, right? More of a novelty item, as it were. So, but if you want to put something like that, but to me, in my headspace, for Dark Ages, I don't. A repeating crossbow just kind of, I don't know. You start getting into like Gatling gun territory almost. Although they didn't work quite that effectively. Uh, but you can do that. In fact, actually, a few years ago, running a campaign, I think it was for a youth group, and like one of the kids had the fire in the head. Shout out talent, which allows you to fire in the head. By the way, it means inspiration. It's a little Celtic phrase to create or be inspired by. He had that talent which allowed him to invent things as long as it wasn't too ridiculous. Like it would have to play off of some existing stuff. And he invented the Taikanaran repeating crossbow, and then went around and tried to sell it to some of the local lords, and that was kind of a fun thing. So to let that happen in the game, and it was already supported by a talent and some crafty thinking by the kid player, and I think he had really several skill levels in the crafting skill and like a pretty high intelligence. He was able to kind of get away with that, so that was pretty cool. But he did figure out, this is a good lesson for the kid, like how economics work, like how expensive it was to get these things made, and like having to train the right people to do them because nobody knew how to build them before. So that was actually kind of a lot of fun. Let's see, whatever their inventions. Trebuchets may or may not exist. They're kind of like early Middle Ages and actual history, but they kind of come at the coattails of Dark Ages. Other than that, you're going to have like catapults, light and heavy is kind of the general classification. Ballista or ballistae, plural, or ballistas, light and heavy for the most part. You've got scorpions, which are basically the same thing. It's just kind of the Roman version of like a ballista. Battering rams been around forever. Anything that you can use to batter gates open. They don't even have to be the fancy ones you see in the Lord of the Rings. All those are cool as well. So just stuff like that. Just kind of like the Dark Ages did have some pretty cool inventions, probably more than most people realize, but not like to a massive degree. So yeah, just keep that in mind for aesthetics as well as statting out, adding statistics to various things. Oh, speaking of which, the last thing I'll mention on the inventions and tech level thing, stone castles did exist. I know a lot of historians say, well, they weren't really stone until the Normans came into the British Isles. Somewhat true, but the Romans had stone fortifications before that. So basically, what they're saying is that there were stone fortifications. The Dark Ages came, which is another reason it's called the Dark Ages. It's claimed to have like kind of was a step backwards in tech. Partly that is true, partly not true. Things did advance in the Dark Ages, but they're just not as well written. So the locals were building, going back to wooden palisades, using a lot of wood, and maybe they supplemented with stone. In fact, there's a lot of proof that they used nearby ruined Roman outposts to build other walls around the town or a fortification of some sort. So I guess what I'm getting at is that if you really want to go for a more of an early Dark Ages, wooden palisades is really kind of the way to go. A lot of wooden fortresses, but maybe supplemented with stone, and then save the stone fortifications for like something really grand, like a capital city or some really wealthy lords holding or something like that. So, nextly, we've got magic and sorcery. Uh, so, magic and sorcery in the Dark Ages. So, first of all, this goes back to sword and sorcery, right? So, sword and sorcery is a subgenre of medieval fantasy or fantasy where magic definitely exists, right? Because it's a fantasy setting. But often it's kind of referred to as sorcery, and the big difference is, and I know Dungeons and Dragons doesn't really make a difference between the two, but I want to bring it back to more like early writings of fantasy authors, way before Dungeons and Dragons, where the term magic and sorcery, though related and sometimes the same, are actually different enough in many other connotations. For example, magic is like the general overarching thing of something wondrous that happens that can't be explained by science, that some magician muttered into being, whether he's a servant of the gods or whether he's like a more of an arcane caster or something like that. Uh, that's kind of the overarching thing. Sorcery makes is a little darker, particularly in like the Conan stories or some of the early sword and sorcery, where there was a big price to pay for knowing these strange secrets, and it would make the stories really fascinating. It's kind of sad that Dungeons and Dragons has kind of got away from that, where magic just kind of happens and there never seems to be any kind of real drawback. I find that kind of boring. I feel like you're missing some storytelling opportunities there. Savage Kingdoms does have a little bit of a darker tinge to if you critically fail a magical arts roll, some bad stuff can happen. Sadly, it doesn't happen quite as much as I kind of wanted it to when I first designed the game. I'm looking at changing that a little bit in the next edition that I'm working on, the fourth edition. But I'm probably not going to get too carried away with it. In my other game, Red Sun, it probably occurs a little bit more, a mishap on the spell. That can be kind of cool and nasty, but I don't know. My point is, like, sorcery usually has a price to pay, and it's also known as kind of looked at as cheating. Whereas magic is almost like more earned. It's like and it's more of a bloodline thing. Like elves are assumed to be magical creatures, and therefore performing magic is like natural to them. Whereas humans, not being born with like a magical bloodline, so to speak, or supernatural bloodline, we have to learn sorcery, meaning that it's like kind of a cheat way. We have to dabble and we have to use bat wings and strange herbs and mandrake and maybe the blood of a virgin sacrifice or something like that on a new moon night or something like that. So all of these things have to come into play in order to make this spell happen, and even then it might not go well. A good example is like Khal Drogo and the Game of Thrones stories. So whereas at this time in Westeros, magic, at least direct magic, was really rare. It was kind of coming back, when the dragons and the White Walkers were coming back around. But men, people, women, people, humans themselves were still like having to dabble in like with leech craft and what I would call sorcery, kind of like dark, gritty magic, dark arts, arcane arts, that kind of thing. And so that spell that witch cast on Khal Drogo, it didn't come out right, right? He technically came back to life, but he was like a zombie, right? He was like couldn't really speak and just was like this kind of zombie, shadowy version of Khal Drogo. So that's a good example of someone using sorcery and it often not really going correctly the way it should. Lots of cool storytelling potential in there, so don't just overlook that. Alchemy also, let's see, in the magic of sorcery. So alchemy exists in Savage Kingdoms, and let me kind of break it down a little bit. So alchemy in modern speak would be chemistry, right? It all started in alchemy. You could even see the chemos is the root word. So, but alchemy or alchemia, as it was called in the East, is a pretty ancient art, and originally it was all mostly focused on transmuting things, particularly turning lead to gold or something like that, as you've heard in some of the stories. King Midas is a good example. But it eventually became even more into transmutation. What if we could turn stuff to gold? Could you turn stuff to silver? Could you make an enemy's gold turn to iron or something like that? And then even more so, like how certain elements can create other elements or create different concoctions or substances. And so the early form of alchemy is the way to kind of look at it in the Dark Ages, more of a, and it's almost in Savage Kingdoms. In fact, it's called the Eighth Magic because it does have some magic craft and some sorcery knowledge involved, but mixed with a little bit of science. So look at it as a kind of a mystical science, I think is what makes it really cool. If you bring it too scientifically and too much into like modern chemistry, it probably loses its flavor, and then you start getting into more Renaissance era, all the way into a modern era, and completely out of like Dark Ages context. So be careful with that. So I think if you keep it more mystical and kind of almost like think of it like early forms of like chemistry and alchemia, uh, creating acids and poisons and stuff like that. And a lot of it has herbalism base in it because a lot of alchemy comes from plants. Not all of it, but some of it. Some of it is from natural materials like arsenic is a good example. It's a natural element. It actually occurs in the earth crust, um, and that can be turned into a really powerful poison. In fact, it's known as the king of poisons. So yeah, so look at it like that. So also another thing I guess I would put in the magic and sorcery and or alchemia category is chirurgery. So chirurgery is a medieval term for surgery, for modern medicine, basically. Now, surgery, and probably most of you guys know this, but surgery goes pretty far back. They found, like the Aztecs were doing surgery on people. Even the Egyptians were doing surgery. It's kind of weird. They kind of ignored the brain, it seems like, for the most part. But there's some examples that they were doing. They were removing cancers or something from the torsos and legs and limbs from some of the people, by all evidence. We're not sure how successful it was. I mean, maybe the victims never survived, or maybe they got tetanus, or who knows. But the point is, there was evidence that mankind did know, like, sometimes you have to open up someone in order to fix them or remove whatever it is inside. But the whole idea of chirurgery came along a little bit later, and this is probably a term that would come in around the early Middle Ages, so it's technically just outside of the Dark Ages realm, but I still think the term really kind of fits. So if you want to use it, and the reason I use it like the term chirurgery is like when I use the term surgery, like you guys know me if you've gamed with me before or seen my other videos. I'm very particularly in my word choice, I guess, as a writer and maybe as an actor as well. Like words are very powerful and they evoke different imagery. So I try not to use a lot of modern words when I'm game mastering, running a session of Savage Kingdoms or Dungeons and Dragons because I think it takes people out of it. Immersion, I think, is a really fun and cool thing. So think about using the word chirurgery. In and of itself was like it was if you look like do some research on actual chirurgery, it was kind of like it was pretty primal, pretty primeval. Our ancestors were kind of on the right path in some things leading into modern medicine, but a lot of it was just a lot of it was based on kind of old religious beliefs and stuff like that, and so some of it was dead ends, but some of it produced pretty interesting results. And some of the old practices are still technically correct. Like people kind of laughed at ancient people using leeches, but modern medicine uses occasionally uses leeches, not usually not ordained Western medicine necessarily, but some of the fringe medicines use leeches. They literally do draw out poisons from your body. Unfortunately, they also draw out good stuff sometimes. That's the drawback. But the point is, some of these early forms of healing arts, or chirurgery, if you will, have some merit, not only in realism and real history, but also in a like quasi-realistic fantasy setting. So cool stuff to keep in mind, perhaps. So the last thing I have is pros and cons. Like, what are the pros and cons of a Dark Ages setting? As I wrap up the video here at 38 minutes. So the pros I have down, not as known, meaning that, remember I was talking earlier about how a lot of fantasy settings are set in kind of high Middle Ages, kind of a default. Whereas Dark Ages is less known. There's very few Dark Ages settings. In fact, the Savage Kingdoms one is only the few that I've actually seen that it's more like we're almost specifically kind of in that era, right? That's or at least flavored in that era. So that to me is a pro. If you want your setting to kind of stand out and be different, or maybe you're even looking at publishing it or something, you've got some market room right there, as we say. The other thing is mysticism. Um, Yeah, like I was saying earlier, the term Dark Ages is really cool because not only does it have a historical connotation for when the Roman Empire withdrew from Britannia all the way through the Viking Age, when supposedly it was a little bit dark and less enlightened, not necessarily fully true, but partly true. Um, and also the atmospheric term that you're using, dark, is kind of cool because it sounds like shadow and darkness, and that's really good for kind of a gritty sword and sorcery setting. And that couches mysticism. You can do there's a lot of mystery there, and there still is in the real world because a lot of things in the Dark Ages, a lot of writings did not exist. A lot of the people back then didn't really read or write unless you were a priest or a noble or something. And so that couches a lot of mysticism, and I think that's kind of fun to play with. So those to me are two pros. A con, though, is also the same as the first prompt. So in other words, not is known as a pro and a con in my opinion. So pro, I just went over like it's like a nice niche that not many people are doing or dealing with. But the drawback is that it also is not as known. So therefore, there might be fewer players that are interested. Are like, oh, I just want to do the shining knights with the big armor stuff because that's all I know. Or if you're running a setting that's already published, by somebody else, maybe there's not as much supplemental materials that deal with more of a Dark Ages setting. So that can also be a bit of a con. Other than that, I can't really come up with any other cons. That's really kind of the only con that I had is that it was maybe it's not as known to some people. Um, anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. I know this video kind of rambled on a little bit longer than I intended, which is pretty normal. But anyway, hope you guys enjoyed. If you made it this far, congratulations, and I will talk to you guys again soon. And by the way, look for Savage Kingdoms 4th edition coming out hopefully in the next couple of months. Talk to you soon.